The floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. So I'm very happy to be here to address this topic because it's what I try to put in the title, connection or reconnection between Latin America and the Muslim world is a topic that makes me or keeps me busy over the last years. And I thank the organizers for this brilliant opportunity to address this rare topic worldwide, because we don't find a lot of spaces or platforms to be able to discuss such an approach. Today I propose to give a quite broad title, Reconnections between Latin America and the Muslim world, to emphasize about contemporary context. Speaking about decolonial politics mostly, a few other aspects if I have time, but it's always a bit difficult in 15 minutes to address many aspects, so I try to focus more on a specific decolonial approach, what it means in that context. First, the driving question behind that, more broadly, it would be to study how could contemporary ties between Latin America and New World, or new Muslim of Latin America, new converts, so-called converts, I will speak about that too a bit later, how these new ties can reshape knowledge, ethics, and politics. That's my main concern here. And this paper is based on a methodology of empirical qualitative sociology, most of it. I spent much time in Colombia, Mexico, a bit in Brazil as well, Honduras, Salvador, different countries. The aim was to visit Muslim congregations, to dive into them like an animation, to take the time to understand the ongoing issues, and then to address their relation with the Muslim world and more broadly with Islam. What it means for new converts, new Muslims, to encounter Islam in that context. First, that's not the topic of my presentation, but I still need to speak about historical background somehow, very quickly, because in the morning we had very interesting presentations. For instance, we had the Dr. Masoud, who addressed this idea of pre-Columbian Muslim navigations. So before Columbus, we had some evidence that Muslims already went to the Americas. But I don't want to focus on that. Just three important reminders about the early encounters between Latin America and the Muslim world. I think there are three main sources, main historical influence to be considered. The first one is the Moriscos, or even Muslims from Maghreb. Moriscos are people who had to convert to Christianity by force. They were not supposed to travel to the Americas, but some evidence show us today that there were Moriscos in territories like the actual Mexicos and other territories in Latin America since the 16th century, who more or less tried to keep their faith, but it was challenged by the Inquisition. It was very difficult to keep Islam at that time because of persecution from the Christian Spaniards authorities. After that, we have a very, very important historical fact that is also neglected often, is the deported Muslim African slaves. Among the African slaves that were brought to the Americas, a lot of them were Muslims. Some scholars speak about 20%, 30%, 15%. It's very difficult to know exactly, but we have evidence that Muslim slaves from Africa, different parts of Africa, were taken to places like Cuba, like Mexico, like Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, and different other areas of Latin America. The question is how they could keep Islamic practice and how their descendants could continue Islamic way of life or not. And in most cases, it was not possible. But in the 19th century, we have interesting historical evidence of the Muslim presence in Brazil. Overall in Salvador de Bahia, but also in Rio de Janeiro. There was an Ottoman navigation team going to Brazil at the time by mistake because of the wind. They arrived in Rio de Janeiro in the 19th century, and the sheikh, the emir of the ship, was surprised to meet Muslims in Rio de Janeiro. So he thought it was a joke because they greet him saying, Assalamu alaikum. And he said, these people make fun of me because there cannot be any Muslims there. Then he found out that these Muslims were actually slaves or descendants of slaves from West Africa. And some people say that till the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we speak about 1920, there were still African Muslims in Brazil, but these presence were disconnected of what we observe now. There was no continuity of historical Muslim communities in the America. The third episode is about Ottoman migrations later, but most of them were Christians, a minority was Muslim, many of them converted to Christianity, or they were just assimilated within the mainstream culture. So also, again, we don't find any continuity of that historical presence in the Americas with the actual current Muslim communities that we have today. And it's important to note that. Because today, the Muslim presence we find in the America is mostly stems from conversions and new waves of migration. Conversions are very important because if you go to several mosques of Mexico and Colombia and other countries, you find out that 80 to 90 to sometimes even 100% of the Muslims in local congregations may be people who converted to Islam. So they rediscover Islam after the ancestor may have known Islam, but the Islamic transmission was cut from the history. No, the question is how these Latin American Muslims reconnect with the Muslim world. That's my main concern. First, I would like to emphasize that conversion is an action, is not a status. And sometimes we make that mistake in our general speech, talking about converts, but converts is a colonial term, coming from colonial Christianity, because in Islam, there is conversion, but there are not such categories as converts. If we look at the Islamic literacy of the past, we don't find any terms talking about converts like specific kinds of Muslims. So it's important to note that. I would rather speak about new Muslims or autochthonous Muslim communities. When I speak about autochthonous, it's to refer to the local character, not saying that they are native or not, because again, in a continent that is shaped by mixed influences from different ethnies, to speak about natives and stratified categories, reified categories, I don't think it makes much sense. But the idea here is to see that there are a lot of people who converted to Islam, and some of them, after the conversion, they try to study Islam more in depth. And they study abroad for some of them, and that's the aspect I would like to develop here with this very short scheme about dual mobility. Meaning learning abroad and coming back to recontextualize Islam back home. It's a very important phenomenon that I could observe over the last years. The first mobility is, even before the first mobility, you have activist Islamic organizations from the Muslim countries going to different parts of Latin America, trying to spread the Islamic message. That's one thing. Then, when you have conversion, a lot of people who convert to Islam, obviously they start from scratch and they need to find out what Islam is about. And for the most motivated people, they would go abroad, like in Turkey, like here in Istanbul. Some went to Tarim in Yemen, some went to Indonesia, some went to Qom in Iran, or different places where they found scholarships. They try to study Islam. That's the first part of the mobility, based on the acquisition of Islamic knowledge. The second part, the second process is very important as well. It means that they came back to their home country with Islam, but they make sense of Islam in the specific environment. In that sense, they contributed to the Islamic discursive theology, because Islam is a lived theology that takes into account the contextual realities. And Latin American new Muslims, to some extent, they did that coming back to their country, not replicating Islam as they studied in Egypt or in Indonesia, but making an effort to interpret it in the light of the context. That's how we can speak about decolonial perspective here at diverse levels. Because first of all, we always see decolonial motivations behind conversions to Islam in Latin America. For a lot, it means ruptures from Christianity and from the colonial influence from Spain and Portugal. But also, the entry to Islam, for many of them, mean a quest for universal truth, meaning it doesn't belong to a specific race or a specific ethnic group, but it's a universal knowledge that doesn't pertain to anybody. And here, some would argue that there is some common elements between Islamic cosmology and previous native cosmologies speaking about a monist vision of life, like a tawhid, like an idea in which the spirit and the body cannot be fully dissociated. It's the argument for a more holistic approach of Islam and of life. What's interesting also is that a lot of new Muslims convoke some rhetorics and narratives that insist on previous affiliation or belonging of their so-called ancestors. Black-skinned Latin American would speak about African ancestors who happened to be Muslims for part of them. Native Americans would speak about common ontologies that they had in their previous culture with Islamic teachings. For the others, they would speak about Al-Andalus references, saying that we can't, as we saw in the morning, dissociate the history of Latin America with the history of Al-Andalus and the Muslim influence in Spain. So that's different ways to echo with heritage, with legacy, but also it implicates that these new Muslims try to make sense of Islam with that in mind, meaning that they want to emphasize on their quest for an authentic Islam, which is not pertaining to a specific culture, but which is universal. In that sense, they refuse any form of oppression because they say that Islam is for anybody. That's also why the term of convert is not fully accepted somehow, because they become part of the Ummah like any other Muslims, and they contribute to the framing of Islam according to the new context. To speak a bit about epistemology, my colleagues will develop more the subject, I think, in the best way that I can do, so I try to keep brief. But it's interesting to understand the concept of epistemicides of de Souza that speak about the Western hegemony in history that removed Islamic references, but also other non-Islamic references as well. And these epistemologies and systems of knowledge were banned from the Western world, but through colonization, we still see that in 2025, including in this Muslim world. We can go to many universities, we find out that the dominant epistemology, value system, knowledge system is embedded in modern Western or postmodern Western influences, which have nothing to do with other like the Islamic epistemologic system. It's very important, I think, for Muslims and others to try to restore these preconceptions or this alternative epistemologic system, like the idea of Tawhid. We spoke about that at intellectual and conceptual level, but also we can see how it applies in politics, how it applies for liberation theology. Because once somebody appreciates the depth of Tawhid, he cannot be racist. He will reject any form of racism and the hierarchy between human beings. It is a very powerful tool also for politics. Tool is not a word because it's not appropriate to it, but it's like the side effect of the faith would be to have an impact in society and politics as well. So here, to speak about theory and praxis, I wanted to quote Abdurrahman Taha, to speak about him a little bit, the Moroccan Muslim philosopher, because he's one of the rare thinkers who who developed at least Islamic epistemology and system of knowledge which is independent from the hegemonic modern and postmodern Western system. And for him, he argues that knowledge is not just based on theory, but it has to do with practice. We can't dissociate that. That's why it's so important to go back to epistemology, because diverse relations to knowledge will have diverse meanings in social life and political life as well. And here, also for Abdurrahman Taha, as well as most Muslim thinkers, there is no only the Burhan tradition in Islam. I would argue that the Western knowledge system is based on Burhan, most of everything else. But in Islam, you have this balance between Burhan, Bayan, and Irfan, which is experience, which has, the terms have been developed by different scholars over the centuries. But that shows that this will emphasize on an alternative epistemological regime in which is not just about rational thought, because rationality is just not logical. It's also based on experience. Irfan is based also on tradition, based on the idea that there was a revelation and that there was a prophet that brought knowledge to earth. So now the challenge is to reclaim this epistemology, which is not easy because even in some so-called Islamic universities, some would deny this alternative epistemology to try to follow the mainstream Western influence. With that, we can see also that Latin American Muslims can reinterpret Islam in light with their experience, and they are quite interesting to put that in practice against oppression, against racism, against Western hegemony as well. Finally, there are still challenges and tensions to be quoted, because I think my time is almost finished, but it's important to be aware of some problems we see also in Latin America when talking about da'wah, when talking about spreading Islam. First, there are sometimes something that looks like neo-colonial dynamics. Foreign preachers coming with Islam, but at the same time they try to impose their cultural assets as an Islamic reality that everybody has to follow. And it's quite problematic. An interesting response in Latin America was the rise of autochthonous community-led theological reflections. Muslim scholars who take the time to study Islam, and they are able to make sense of Islam in their specific context without just replicating the cultural norms that they brought from outside. Also, another problem is the doctrinal fragmentation about what Islam means, because you have a lot of actors today in Latin America. Just to speak about the Turkish influences, you have Süleyman Celer, you have Nur Jamat, you have also mainstream Hanafi, Maturidi scholars, but you have Shia Muslims, you have Salafi Muslims, Madkhali or Sururi, you have different turuq, and you have also Tabligh Jamaat, for instance. And all these actors in Latin America, they try to present Islam as if it belongs to their group somehow, which is a strategical mistake as well, because it may blur the understanding of what is the universalistic characteristic of Islam. But the Latin American new Muslims show very interesting examples when they appropriate themselves the Islamic knowledge and they make sense of them in their reality. The final risk I identified is the one of instrumentalizing Islam for identity politics. Again, I would say that it's a colonial postmodern risk, because it's not from the context, but it came mostly from US influence, and that's something that we would like to develop in another presentation, hopefully, because it's a long topic by itself. Now, to conclude, I would say that Latin American Muslims are making a bridge between the Muslim world and Latin America. So on the one hand, they are ambassadors of Islam in Colombia and Mexico and Brazil. On the other hand, they are ambassadors of Latin American in the Muslim countries. And it's a crucial role they play. In addition to that, they contribute to reshape epistemic and political understandings of Islam through a restored idea of Tawhid, which has to express not only in theory, not only in the faith, but in practice as well. And here we can quote the example of the Liberation Theology, that we have interesting results going on now. And finally, due to the specific identity that they have, their positioning, they also are mediators to be able to reshape the discourses and to contribute to the ongoing Islamic tradition, meaning that Islam is lived tradition. It starts from the revelation and it always applies to new context, but it resonates with the context and it participates in this dialectic relation to the world. And in that sense, I think that many new American Muslims are doing quite well. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much. I think that you cannot escape the same struggles everywhere. You know, the struggle between authenticity